Now, of course, there is a context to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani that is important to talk about. It's a context that begins many decades ago, when the United States and Britain and other Western imperial powers decided to overthrow the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 in Iran. And of course, Mossadegh had come to power promising to nationalize oil in Iran, and he also had a pretty progressive social platform that he was promising to the Iranian people. And when he finally was toppled and the Shah was installed in Iran, there was a 26-year brutal reign that was backed up by the United States. And then you had the US bolstering and supporting Saddam Hussein as he rose to power in Iraq. In fact, the CIA provided to Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Iran's neighbor, the list of people who were suspected to be communists as they overthrew the regime of Abdul Qasim Karim, who was also a popular leader of Iraq and had moved to nationalize their oil. And when the Islamic Revolution happened in Iran in 1979, the United States began to redouble its efforts to back up Saddam and make him the premier US client in that region. And they actually, under the Reagan-Bush administration, lifted Iraq off of the nations that were categorized as state sponsors of terrorism so that the US could openly sell weapons to Saddam Hussein to be used in his war against Iran. And for more than 8 years, Iran and Iraq fought a mercilessly bloody war where more than 1 million people were killed, and the United States was arming both sides, but disproportionately favoring Saddam Hussein. In fact, when Saddam was at his most brutal in the 1980s, when he was using chemical weapons, and by the way, those chemical weapons attacks were aided by the United States selling attack vessels to deliver those chemical weapons. Saddam was at his most brutal when the US was offering him the most support. The policy in Washington was regime change in Iran from the moment the Islamic Revolution began. And ultimately, the Iran-Iraq War failed to overthrow Saddam Hussein's regime, but the United States wanted payback, payback that extends to Donald Trump's threats to bomb 52 sites in Iran, including cultural institutions. Iran has basically been in a permanent state of siege since 1979 and since the United States supported Saddam Hussein in Iraq and his brutal regime. Throughout the 1990s, you had this sort of high-stakes diplomacy, negotiations, threats of sanctions, threats of war going on. But on 9/11, when the 9/11 attacks happened, Iran's response at first was to offer support to the United States in a clandestine way, including from the Revolutionary Guard Corps, because the Taliban government in Afghanistan was also an enemy of the Iranian regime. Once George W. Bush gave a speech written by #resistance figure David Frum that identified Iran as part of the axis of evil, that door was basically slammed shut. And throughout the Bush administration's 8 years in power, at any moment, war with Iran, overt war with Iran, could have happened. You had the same kinds of very hawkish neocons that now pepper certain quarters of the Trump administration, pushing for an all-out war against Iran and regime change against Iran. Among them, the not that long ago departed National Security Advisor John Bolton. Obama took office. He implemented sanctions and continued sanctions in Iraq that did target in Iran, that did target Iranian civilians. But the Obama administration's approach was to try to resolve the nuclear issue in a manner that ultimately would lead to some form of negotiation. While all of this was happening, you had Iranian nuclear scientists being assassinated. You had covert operations taking place in Iran, but generally speaking, in both Tehran and in certain quarters politically of the United States, the Obama nuclear deal was about as good of a deal that Iran could get under the current structure of the US government, and understanding that in both the Democratic and Republican parties, you had very hawkish individuals that would love to see regime change in Iran. Donald Trump campaigned on a promise to commit war crimes. And in fact, he openly tweets threats to commit war crimes. And he has even campaigned during this election season with actual war criminals that the US military has acknowledged are war criminals. So this is a different front-facing facade of the US empire, even though much of Trump's foreign policy is consistent with presidential administrations throughout history outside of the context of the rhetoric. So which brings us to the present moment, where you have had, in the aftermath of the US invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003, Iran, which is directly next door to Iraq, playing an increasingly important role in various aspects of Iraqi society. Some of it has been good, social services, basic organization of society, and some of it has been playing proxy war games, facilitating militias, facilitating attacks. Qasem Soleimani definitely was a major player in that. He also was a major player in the fight against ISIS. At times, the United States even offered air cover for operations that Qasem Soleimani's forces were conducting on the ground. And when the Trump administration said that they were taking Qasem Soleimani out to prevent an imminent threat from being carried out, we have to wonder then about the reports that say that he's been on the kill list in the Trump administration for some 7 months. The Gang of Eight, the ranking member of the House and Senate Intelligence Committee, the chairs of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, the leadership of both parties in both houses of Congress were not informed in advance that the United States was going to be assassinating a foreign military official on a third country's soil. No, who was informed? It was Republican Senator Mike Lee, a prominent Trump supporter, who came out and said that what they are trying to do in these briefings is unconstitutional. He said it was the worst briefing that he's been to in 9 years on military matters, and said that Mike Pompeo and the chair of the Joint Chiefs were basically saying to lawmakers, you are not allowed to debate this in public because it's going to undermine the security of the United States. So we are in this moment right now when there are fears of a wider war. But it is so important to understand that this assassination that the Trump administration carried out against General Soleimani, followed by more sanctions, economic sanctions that are overwhelmingly targeted at civilians, these are acts of war. So it's not just a discussion about what happens next in Iran. Is the US going to go to war? We have to recognize that the war is already on. And the question is, how can it be stopped and who will stop it?